Welcome to the Writer Reads Chronicles of a Dark God, Book 2, Dark God's Rise, Chapter 49, Ending the Game. Raomar saw the magic-bound cloud that was the Old One pulled into the opal's flickering black and green surface. He watched until he sensed the spell come to an end and the prison seal shut, and then he stepped back, out of the chamber and away from the grotto in which the opal was confined. He signalled for those with him to do the same, waiting for the last to leave before following. Pausing at the archway, he watched the elements of death and decay resume the forms he'd first seen. Death became a swirling, multicoloured mist, and not red tinged as she'd been before, but more a dark green, like a hailstorm with jagged, coloured lightning flashing in her depths. Decay ceased being a solid lid covering the pit, and Raomar gagged at the sudden stench. As he reeled back, Decay laughed and sank into the pit, confining his stench to the prison's chamber. With eyes streaming at the odour of rot and decay, Raomar bowed his thanks to the pair. As he took another step back, he imagined he saw them bow in return. No words were spoken as he faced the elemental lords who'd answered summons and come to his aid. There were four of them, one of each of the four main elements: earth, fire, air, and water. They were still now and showed no sign of life. He reached up to touch the tiered surface of the dormant Earth Lord and saw how the elements of plant life were already tending to their Lord. Creepers had started twining over the Lord's surface and Creepers had started twining over the Lord's surface, and green-bodied beings were planting seeds and embedding bushes in its hide. He sighed and couldn't help smiling as an elemental of stone lifted and laid a path of gravel around the edge of the sleeping Lord. It was a relief knowing the once mighty being would be well cared for as it slept. And protected, he thought, laying a grateful hand against its side. Turning, he surveyed the gardens, wanting to see how the lords of air, fire, and water had fared. He smiled when he found them. The Lord of Air was being supported by a host of attendant air elementals. Noticing his attention, one of them came to soothe his fears. "We will take turns keeping the Great One aloft," it assured him. "Each new generation will take part in this duty, and all will know his name and what he has done in our protection. He will not be alone or forgotten when he wakes." "He helped save our world too," Raomar acknowledged. "You and yours have our gratitude for your care." It blew a playful gust across his face, reminding him of spring and newly risen grass, and flew back to its brethren as he bowed in their direction. "As master of the citadel," he said, "you will have all the aid I can give. You only need ask." Breezy laughter replied, and the creatures of air swept down to acknowledge him one by one, tugging his hair and clothing with playful fingers. Their merriment reached him through the chill touch of their tears, and their joy at being saved was bittersweet. Fire had not been so easy to save, and he had risked all, knowing he might meet his end. His kin had done their best to protect him. Stone elementals had woven a hasty barricade, allowing their forms to be fused together at his touch, and letting him come to rest within a circle of stone, his surface steaming gently. The Lord had spent most of his warmth in the spell of binding and transferal, the, op- the opal opening mostly to it, the fire in the gem answering to the fire in the elemental Lord's soul. Now it was cooling. Raomar knew it would need warming if it was to complete its dormancy and live. Worried, he looked toward Adriel. The god of problem solving had followed him silently, making his own observations of the elemental lord's plights and care. He watched as Raomar turned toward him. "My lord Adriel," the beast elf began. Adriel remained silent, waiting, curious to see how Staravan's newest priest would handle making his request. "My lord," Raomar continued, "I need fire to sustain this one, and elementals to keep it alive. I would not see its aid costed its life." Adriel opened his mouth to reply, and was promptly interrupted by the elemental noble that had brought the opal to the garden and then sought the lords. "If I might," it rumbled, "I took the liberty of having my people build a tunnel from the Fire Lord's home to this mountain. The fire elementals will follow, taking care not to harm my folk. They will bring warmth to their lord. It paused, looking troubled. We will, however, need a suitable home of stone built to house them. But, Raomar began, and was interrupted in turn. We will contain the fire, a voice whispered at his side. Raomar pivoted to watch a column of rock grind its way from the ground. The hiss of steel being drawn sounded in its voice, and its teeth glinted as it smiled. Faced by another noble, Raomar bowed. The creature was at least as large as the earth noble to which he had been speaking. I would be honoured, he managed, and caught the flash of a steel-rimmed smile as the rock noble turned away. The honour is ours too, it replied, and there was a gathering rumble as its servants answered its call to service. Raomar watched as they melded together, overlaying the first elemental with the most ornate pool edge Raomar had ever seen. My lord, Raomar said, his voice filled with awe as he turned his attention to Adriel. The god nodded. We have only water to attend, he observed, and motioned for Raomar to continue his search. They were not the first to recognize the Water Lord's vulnerability and need. As with the Fire Lord, other elementals had come to the rescue, and the garden itself had resisted the seepage of the Lord's bulk. Elements of gem, metal, and stone had wound themselves under and around the Water Lord to form the edge and base of another pool. They had honoured it with unexpected creativity too, Raomar noticed. There were ledges and nooks and private courts surrounded by water on all sides save for the path that led into them. There was even a bridge. Raomar couldn't believe his eyes. Metal and gem and rock rested together, their entwined forms reflected in the pool below. Why? He whispered, and the elementals understood. A tribute came in soft chorus, making him weep at the answer. He recognized the honor given the lords by their kin and was humbled. We will do what we can to see them safe, he vowed, and was answered by a murmured agreement that came from all sides. A sudden rush of sound came from behind him, and he turned, hurrying back through the garden to where the Lord of Fire rested. Held inside a pool of rock, lava oozed and spread around the dormant Lord of Fire. Fire weeds rolled under and over their lord, restoring some of the warmth to its cooling hide, and smaller weirds danced across the top of the pool. The surrounding stone took on a ruddy tinge. Welcome, Raomar greeted, and the weirds coiled and pivoted in response. Fire hissed and spat its thanks in reply as they returned to tending their lord. The air weirds brought their slumbering lord to the pool, seeking the fire weird's aid, and after a brief consultation drew their sleeping lord carefully into the warm air rising from the lava pool. Once it was settled on the rising currents, they rejoiced. Now their burden was lighter. Now their lord was wreathed in steam and smoke. Now their lord was honoured. Raomar stared at the sight until he felt someone pulling gently at his sleeve. He glanced across to see Alessia beside him. Before he could ask her what she wanted, she indicated Adriel's retreating form. Lord Adriel, wait, he called. The young god paused halfway to the garden's edge. Why, Keeper? He asked. My task is completed, and your task is begun. His face grew stern. See that you do it well. I will send craftsmen to see what may be found and understood, and priests to discover and give answers when needed. I will not abandon you. Unlike others, hung unspoken in the air between them. The god smiled and walked away, taking the corridor that would take him to the forecourt and the citadel's portals. He raised his hand in brief farewell as he left, fully aware of Raomar watching him until he was out of sight. Endura interrupted him before he could think to follow. Keeper, the Lord Knight said. Lord Knight, Raomar replied. We should select those who will remain to serve you in the citadel, Endura replied. Raomar shook his head. That is a matter for the gods to decide. You should return to Karanth before the people decide they need new rulers. He glanced toward the elementals. The citadel can look after itself until the gods have appointed whom they will, he concluded, and was rewarded by a glowing-eyed rumble from the garden's attendants. Indura nodded and gestured for Raomar to follow in the god's footsteps and lead them from the garden. This time, nothing attacked them as they left, and Brianda's skills weren't needed to unlock the citadel's doors. None of them saw Adriel return to the citadel. The god carried the pouches the messengers had given him, each one containing a potion for the elemental lords who'd answered their call for help. They'd come to help without promise of reward, and now was the time for that reward to be given. As Adriel carefully poured each potion over its corresponding lord, Raomar accompanied the Lord Knight and the priests and wizards and knights back down the mountain. None of them noticed when Samuel Scarlet slipped away from the procession just as it entered Karanth's city gates. The whetstone glowed in its pouch, its warmth reaching out to encompass him. It urged him to the work he'd yet to finish, the griffin and the other commissions awaiting him at the workbench. No one noticed him leave, and with luck, no one would notice his absence from the ceremonial choosing. Samuel had no doubt it would not be the gods but the beast elf who really chose, and he didn't want to be around for the farce. The crowd's attention was on the foremost riders in the group, the holy knights, the beast elf, and the beast elf's companions. Gareth snorted. It was a sad day indeed when Kavarag were welcomed into the city. No one noticed the lone mage as he dropped back from the procession and turned his horse down a side lane. Once the crowd was behind him, he stopped by a set of stairs to dismount before looping his reins over one arm and leading his mount toward home. He'd return it when the beast elf had left. Again Samuel snorted, unaware of the whetstone's constant glow beneath his hand. Slowly, without stretching himself against the barriers of his new prison, Walshira twisted the gemsmith's perception and memory. With infinite care, the Old One used the stone to gain control of the mage's thinking, before polluting it to his view. By the time Samuel had reached the courtyard stable, the god's task was almost complete. All that remained was for the smith to use the stone and speak to it in place of his goddess, just one time more. And of that last Walshira was sure the mage would oblige before the hour was done. The Old One's satisfaction was complete. Inside the gem, along the line traced by a streak of dark blue lightning, the scrape left by his talon grew into a split, and no one, not even his guardians, saw it happen. In the chapel of all gods in Karanth, the gods attended the ceremony of choosing. They materialized from their shadowed etchings above the altars set around its walls. Raomar felt the hair prickle on the back of his neck as each deity came to stand on the dais before the assembled knights, mages, and priests. From the least to the greatest, each god stepped forth to appoint their representative within the citadel of keeping. Some appointed more than one, choosing a priest, mage, and knight, or a combination of two instead of three. Raomar watched and tested each appointment within his heart as Sterivan had shown him. When his god had said, "It will be by his request that all other appointments will be fulfilled," he'd given Raomar the ability to judge the wisdom of each choice. When the roll call of names had ended, and those who had not been called stood apart from those who'd answered their call, the gods descended from the dais. Instead of walking amongst those they had chosen, they focused on those they had not. As they passed among their servants and worshippers, they touched each one on the forehead and murmured a spell of forgetfulness over them. None who felt the touch could remember how it was they'd gone to the citadel, nor what it was they'd seen there. The spell wasn't permanent, but it was long-lasting. In their dotage, some would remember the event in which they'd taken part. Others, more long-lived, would recall it as a deed of the past and remain uncertain of the truth of what they remembered. Of those, some would return to the citadel seeking to know the truth of their memories. They would end their days within its walls, or assisting the keeper in his duty beyond the citadel. Without the immediacy of events to strengthen what they'd recalled, the magnitude of their accomplishment would not be recognized. Those that didn't seek the truth in the citadel would tell it as a tale, and only a few of their listeners would recognize the enormity of what they'd done. Of Sophriel's children, none moved. They looked down from the dais at Alessia, and the wizardess felt the power within rise to the challenge in their eyes, even if she didn't understand why she had to be the one to serve those who'd followed their mother. Again, the power drew and led her. Again, it gave her the words and knowledge of what she must do. Without looking at the dais again, she walked with the gods amongst their people, slowly acknowledging how her soul was beginning to change. When the gods were done, and not one memory remained untouched, they returned to the dais. Alessia walked with them, but stopped at its foot, watching as they walked to stand before their altars. She noticed how only the space before Sophriel's altar stood empty, but when the power tugged at her, urging her to stand before it, she denied it. "I'm not ready," she whispered as she turned away. Raomar held out his arm as she returned to his side and tucked herself beneath it, wrapping it around her for protection. No one seemed to notice what she'd done. All eyes were on the gods. "Endura," Staravan called. "Carandor, Geran, Lanira, Darkanoak, Sylvia, and Talinor." Even as the god of balance called the elves' names, the elven pantheon materialized alongside their human counterparts, and those gathered gasped, Raomar among them. He'd heard of the elven gods, but he'd never thought to encounter them. Now they stood before him and beckoned their children forward. It was no surprise when Magrillo stepped immediately forward, stopping beside Endura, his eyes wide with awe. "Swear the allegiance of your people to the citadel's keeper." It was both command and request. Not one of those called to stand before the gods refused, either with their mouths or their hearts. They swore the oath as one. They were the only ones beside the heads of the wizard guilds and temples whom the gods had not touched and taken all memory of the day's events away. On their heads stood the responsibility of the citadel's safekeeping. The chiefs of the wizard guilds were called soon after, as were the high priests of each temple. No one denied the gods what they asked, and all swore allegiance and aid to the citadel and its keeper. When the swearing in was over, the gods departed and the chapel grew empty once more. A sigh rippled through those who had gathered there, and they slowly looked to Endura. "A feast," the Lord Knight declared, "a feast to celebrate the forging of a new alliance. But first, time to bathe and rest, and enjoy a simple meal." An approving murmur ran through the assembly, and Endura looked toward the chapel doors and clapped his hands. Pantero opened them, accompanied by a host of lesser stewards. "My lord?" "Pantero," Endura acknowledged, then indicated those around him. "These people need to be escorted to their quarters, where they'll require hot water and bath attendants. Their robes will need to be laundered and returned by morning, and they will require a meal. Provide anything they ask if it is within your power." Pantero bowed. "Anything else, my lord?" "A feast, Pantero. A great feast with which to honor new alliances and friendships to be held tomorrow even." Pantero blanched. "Yes, my lord." With that, Endura turned from the steward and looked at Raomar. Dismissed, Pantero led his entourage from the room, hurrying to complete the preparations he'd already begun, and to send the escorts for which his lord had asked. Despite the lack of notice, the feast came together as well as any feast before it, and Staravan, god of balance, heard the steward's whispered gratitude and smiled. He could well understand why the man had chosen to worship him. Seeing the delicate balance in planning and executing the feast, caring for the Lord Knight's guests and attending the Lord Knight's myriad other affairs, Staravan was intrigued. He watched, as did all the gods, the coming together of elves and man and the partings of friends. More than once he felt his gaze stray to the citadel on the mountain. Adriel, problem solver and discoverer of secrets, waited until his fellow gods were too preoccupied to notice, then slipped away. There was a matter of the heart that needed tending. That it should be his had caught him completely unawares. He sought the wizardess and found her in the chapel of all gods. She wasn't alone. Adriel stopped at the door, then hid himself from mortal view to observe her, as she approached Staravan's Kovarag servant. He had been walking between the altars of Enshul and Staravan, his head bowed. In prayer or thought, Adriel hadn't been able to tell. The elf looked up as Alessia approached, frowning, and glanced past her, but not quite at where Adriel stood concealed. "Hello, Mouse," the priest said. Alessia hesitated, glancing back before returning to the chapel door and closing it. "Hello, Raomar," she replied, returning to where he stood. Silence grew between them, awkward and overlong. Adriel forced himself to remain still and not interrupt. In the end, it was Raomar who broke the quiet. "You've come to say goodbye." His voice caught, but he didn't forbid her leaving. Alessia nodded, then hurried to his side. "I'm leaving with the elves, with Lord Darkenoak, in the morning," she said, her own voice catching. I'm going far away from stone walls and cities and the affairs of men." Listening to the sadness in her tones, Adriel couldn't blame her. There were times when he wished. He halted the thought, wanting to follow the exchange before him. Raomar's voice was almost bitter. "And you don't think elves have their intrigues?" He asked it softly, but she started back, placing her hands on his shoulders. "I know they do, Rao, but at least they don't have a penchant for walls of grey stone." Like the temple prison, Adriel thought. Raomar barked a short laugh. "No, Mouse, they have curving halls of marble and petrified wood." His voice softened. "It's not so different, love." Alessia didn't argue. Instead, she regarded him with shimmering eyes. "Bless my journey?" she asked, her voice wavering. There were tears in Raomar's as he replied, "Of course I will. How could I not?" He pivoted to face the altars, calling on Staravan and the elven goddess Fianre, and then he called down the blessing of all the gods. He called, and the gods answered as one. Alessia cried out in surprise, but Raomar ignored her. The blessing invoked, he drew the wizardess against his chest and embraced her. Alessia returned his hug. "Go in peace, my love," he said. "May the rest of your journey be a gentle one." He touched the white streak that had grown in her hair, and his face said he thought she deserved the rest after all she had endured. Alessia took his hand and held it in her own, then turned it and kissed his palm and placed it over her heart. "May blessing walk in your path and your guardianship be untroubled," she said, her voice tremoring despite her best efforts. Then she folded his hand against his chest, patted it, and walked resolutely away. Adriel stayed where he was, observing her leave, and observing too the sadness etched into Raomar's expression as he let her go. He did not move, even when the door closed behind her, or when the Kavarag sank to his knees before Staravan's altars, his shoulders shaking with emotion. The god allowed several heartbeats to pass before returning his form to allow mortal gaze. He took a few steps from the door, then allowed his steps to be heard. Raomar cocked his head at his approach, but it was only when Adriel came to a halt behind him that he rose to his feet. He kept his face turned towards Staravan's altar, drying his eyes before turning to see who had come to see him. His eyes widened when he saw Adriel waiting. "My lord?" he asked. Adriel gestured toward the door. "Have no fear for your wizardess," the god told him. "I will walk with her a while. At least," he added with a small self-conscious smile, "until she tells me she desires me elsewhere." Raomar nodded, and if he resented the god's interest in Alessia, he didn't say. Instead, he replied, "That would be well," and watched the god's presence fade. The dawnlight had barely touched the morning mists when Indura came to bid the beast elf farewell. Brianda, the Northlander, and the smaller Thagramorg half-breed were with the yellow-haired priest, and all were cloaked against the cold. "I will not leave the citadel again," Raomar told Indura. The knight frowned. "We will need regular reports," he said. "How do you intend to do that?" Raomar viewed him with a carefully blank stare. I don't, he said, delivering the refusal in mild tones. He continued before the knight could argue. That task is one I have given to Brianda Bloodthorn. The look the half-elf turned to him might have been comical if the situation hadn't been so grave. Excuse me, she said, her tone saying she had a problem with the plan. Raomar frowned at her, and Grunwald shook his head. Brianda plunged on, ignoring both looks. My father crossed our trail in the forest north of Wildergen. I need to go in search of him. You can't, Raomar replied. You're sworn to serve me, and you owe me a guild debt. Brianda broke off, open-mouthed. You can't mean... Before she could continue, the Lord Knight interrupted. I accept your appointed ambassador, he said, obeying Staravan's prompting in his soul to add. And should news of her father reach her and she be released from ambassadorial duties to seek him, I will accept your appointed replacement, as long as I am able to attend in person the instatement of that replacement. Raomar gave a sigh of relief and bowed to the paladin. It did not help that he heard Staravan laughing in his heart, but he forced himself to be gracious none the less. My lord, he replied, your request is heard and granted. Travel well, Master Philomath, the Lord Knight said, clapping him on the shoulder. May your rule be one of peace, my lord, the Kavarag replied. Endura let his hand drop and watched Raomar ride away. He watched until the mist obscured the beast elf and his three companions from view. He would have continued staring into the mist, but the rider who guarded him cleared his throat and spoke. Excuse me, my lord, the man began, continuing when Endura looked at him. The chief steward bid me remind you that you have guests at the palace.